Today we're going to continue factoring to solve. So we need to, once again, make sure that when we are factoring, we're going to remember that the very first step to factoring is to always look for a GCF. So in this first example here, x squared plus 3x minus 40 equals 0. It is in the form that we want because remember, in order to solve by factoring, I always want to have my equation set equal to 0. So far, so good. So now I want to look for a GCF. I notice that there is technically just a 1 in front of the x squared. And so that means that with 1 being the smallest number, there's not going to be a number that they have in common other than 1, and taking out a 1 isn't going to change any of the numbers. If I look at the very last term, I only see a number. I don't see any variables. So with not every single term having an x and not every single term having a number other than 1 in common, there is no GCF. So remember, when there's no GCF and everything's to one side where it equals 0, we get to think about what is going to multiply to the last number, but add to the number here in the middle. So I'm looking for numbers that multiply to negative 40. Well, if I need to multiply to a negative, that means that one of my numbers is positive and one of my numbers is negative. Because I want the middle number to be a positive, that means that you really want the bigger number to be positive. So if you're thinking about different factors of 40, you can go through the list, but if I have a positive 8 and a negative 5, that will definitely multiply to negative 40. And if I add those, because the 8 is bigger, we really subtract because they're opposite signs, and I keep the sign of the bigger number. So I do get that positive 3 in the middle. So 8 and negative 5 are my two numbers. So remember, I'm going to have my sets of parentheses, and I still have an equation that equals 0. I start each of my parentheses off with an x because x times x will get me that x squared. That 8 is going to go in one of them and it's positive. The 5 goes in the other, but it's negative. And now because I've factored, but I need to finish solving, I get to set each factor that contains an x equal to 0. Well, that means that x plus 8 gets to be set equal to 0, and x minus 5 gets to be set equal to 0. So as I continue solving here, I'm going to put a line down my equal sign so I know if I do something to one side of the equation, I have to do it to the other to keep it balanced. To move the 8, I'm going to have to subtract it. The 8's go away on the left. That gives you the x by itself. 0 minus 8 is negative 8. Over here, I have to add the 5 to move it over. Those are opposites. That disappears. 0 plus 5 is going to give me positive 5. So here are my two answers, because once again, when this is an x squared problem, that exponent of 2 tells me that I should have two answers. All right, if we take a look at this next one, we've got 2x squared plus 16x plus 32 equals 0. So far, it's set up correctly because I've got everything to one side and it equals 0. But because my goal is to factor, we got to look for a GCF. I see that there's a 2 out in front of the x squared. Well, notice that 2 times 8 is 16. And we can divide 2 into 32 as well. That's going to give us 2 times 16 is going to give us 32. So notice that this time I do have a GCF. They all contain a 2. Noticing that that last number doesn't have a variable, the only GCF then is going to be that number. And so I want to write that number on the outside, and then in parentheses, I want to put everything that's left over back inside, and then it's still going to equal 0. So 2x squared, I get out the 2, which means I'm left with the x squared. 16 we don't have to worry about because it got broken up into 2 times 8. I took the 2 out. That means that I'm going to have a positive 8 with that x in the middle still. I can ignore the 32. I've got 2 times 16. The 2 got taken out. It's a positive sign, so plus 16. All right, now that I took out that GCF, I noticed that inside the parentheses, there's just a 1 in front of the x squared. So I'm telling myself I can factor by thinking about numbers that multiply to that last number and add to the number in the middle. All right, so everything is positive, so I get to keep everything positive when I'm factoring. Numbers that multiply to 16 but add to 8. Notice that 4 times 4 multiplies to 16, and 4 plus 4 is going to get you that 8 that we're looking for. That GCF of 2 still needs to be out in front, and then I can do my 2 parentheses, still an equation, it has to equal 0. But I get to take x for each of my parentheses to start them off, because once again, x times x will get me that x squared that's in the middle, or that's inside the parentheses there. And then because both of these are positive 4s, I get to put plus 4 and plus 4. Now, remember, I want to solve for x. While it was important to take that GCF out, I noticed that the GCF doesn't contain any variables. I don't want to set 2 equal to 0. That doesn't make sense. If I did 2 equals 0, that's a false statement. 2 does not equal 0. So unless that GCF has a variable, it's no longer important to us. Notice that everything that I have in both of my parentheses are exactly the same. So there's really no need for me to set both of those equal to 0 if it's the exact same thing. So here I only have one equation to solve. X plus 4 equals 0. I'm going to subtract that 4 over to the other side. 0 minus 4 is going to give me then negative 4. Once again, I do technically have two answers, but the answer is the same thing. It's negative 4 two different times. So that's why I'm allowing you just to write it once, but know that there are technically two answers. All right, checking out this next one. We have 2x squared plus 5x plus 3 equals 0. Once again, it's set up how we want because everything's to one side and it equals 0. If I start looking for a GCF, I notice that 2 is the smallest number. But if I try to break it up, 2 times something, not going to get me 5. 2 times something, not going to get me 3. So there is no number in common. When I look, the 3 doesn't have a variable. So there are no variables in common, which means there is no GCF. So remember, if there's a number that's out in front of the x squared, we're going to have to do guess and check, which means we start with that number out in front of the x squared and think about all the ways to multiply to 2. Well, luckily for us, there's only one way. There's a 1 times 2. So then remember, that means that when we're starting our parentheses, there has to be a 1 with one of the x's and there has to be a 2 with the other, because 1x times 2x is going to get you back to that original 2x squared. Then I look at the very last number. How do I multiply to 3? Well, luckily for us, there's only one way. It's 1 times 3. But this is where now the guessing comes into play. I have to guess where I want to put the 1 and where I want to put the 3 because it still has to add to that middle term of 5x. Everything is positive, so I want to put plus signs for both of the parentheses. And then remember, it is still an equation. This equals 0. So I'm going to guess where the numbers 1 and 3 go. I'm going to guess the 1 goes first and the 3 goes second, but now I have to check to make sure my guess is correct. So remember, to check, I multiply the outside terms together. 1x times 3 is going to give me 3x. I then have to multiply the inside terms together. 1 times 2x is 2x. Notice that if I add those like terms, I'm hoping to get 5x because that's what's in the middle. And lucky for us, that is exactly what we get. So we know that we guessed correctly. Now we have to finish. Now I want to set each of those parentheses equal to 0. Because there's a 1 in front of the x, you don't really have to write it. So I can just write x plus 1 equals 0. And then I also have 2x plus 3 equals 0. And so once again, I'm going to put a line going through the equal sign so then I can make sure I go step by step and solve correctly. So in the first equation, x plus 1 equals 0. I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides. That's enough to get the x by itself. 0 minus 1 is negative 1. Over here in the other equation, I'm going to start with the number that is not attached to the x. So I have to subtract 3. That still keeps a 2 with the x, but 0 minus 3 is negative 3. Last step is I have to get rid of that multiplication by dividing. The 2's then go away. If you try to put that in a calculator, negative 3 divided by 2 is not going to be the nice number. It's going to be a decimal. So I would just leave it as that fraction. If you can reduce, reduce. But in this case, 3 and 2 don't have anything in common. Don't lose the negative sign. X equals negative 1 and negative 3 halves. Those are my answers. Okay, last example here together. We've got 3x squared plus 2x minus 8 equals 0. Once again, set up how I want. It equals 0. Let's check for a GCF. I'm looking at my numbers. I see 2 is the smallest number. Can I get 2 times something to be 3? And my answer is no. So even though I can get 2 times 4 to be 8, it doesn't work with every single number. So that means that we don't have a GCF as far as numbers are concerned. When I look at the very last term, that negative 8 doesn't have a variable. So once again, there is no GCF. So I have to do that guess and check process, start with the number in front of the x squared. Luckily, there is only one way to multiply to 3. That's 1 times 3. So once again, when I'm thinking about my parentheses, I have to start one of my parentheses with a 1x, but the second parenthesis is going to be a 3x. Then I move on to the very last number. Now notice that it's a negative 8. So I have to have one positive and one negative. So like 1 times negative 8 would multiply to negative 8, or negative 1 times positive 8. Another option would be 2 times negative 4, or negative 2 times 4. So this time there are several more options for us to then guess. But remember, once we do our guessing, we want to check to see that it adds to that positive 2x in the middle. All right, so let's go ahead and figure out what numbers do we want to use in our guessing. So I think I might start with the 2 and the 4 because they're closer together. And so I think I'm going to put the positive 2 first and the negative 4 second. Okay, there's my guess. I have no idea if I'm correct. Now I'm going to check. So once again, I multiply the outside terms together. 1x times negative 4 is negative 4x. Then I'm going to multiply the inside terms together. 2 times 3x is 6x. When I combine those like terms, look at that. I got lucky. I got my middle term of a positive 2x, which means I get to set each of those equal to 0. Once again, that 1x plus 2, I can just write as x plus 2. You can keep the 1 if you want, but got to set it equal to 0. And then the 3x minus 4 is going to equal 0 as well. So then we are going to subtract 2 from both sides to get that x by itself. So 0 minus 2 is negative 2. Over here, we've got a couple of steps. We're going to have to first move the number not attached, which would be that 4. So the opposite of a negative is a positive. So I add 4 to both sides. 3x then is going to equal 0 plus 4 is 4. Last step then is to divide by 3. Once again, if you take that in your calculator and divide, it's not going to be a nice whole number. It's going to have a decimal there. So just leave it as a fraction. It doesn't reduce down any further because 4 and 3 don't have any numbers in common. So these are my two solutions. Okay, so here's a checkpoint problem for you. Go ahead, pause the video, and try this. X squared minus 8x minus 48 equals 0. All right, hopefully you paused the video and tried it. Now let's walk through it together. I see that I'm looking for a GCF, but I don't have one because there's no number that they have in common other than 1, and that 48 doesn't have a variable. Because there's just a 1 in front of the x squared, I just get to ask myself what multiplies to the last number but adds to the number in the middle. So then I'm going to think about numbers that multiply to negative 48. All right, so I mean, I've got quite a few numbers here. It's an even number, so definitely 2 goes into it. I'm going to do 4 and 12, and one of them has to be negative. I'm going to make the 12 negative. So notice that that will multiply to negative 48, and if I add them together, there is the negative 8 in the middle. So once again, I've got x plus 4 for one of the parentheses, x minus 12 for the other. Because this equals 0, I get to set each of those factors equal to 0 and solve, which means I need to subtract the 4 over to the other side, which then would give you x to be negative 4, and I'd have to add the 12. And 0 plus 12 is going to get me 12. So here are my two solutions.